"This is a family recipe," she used to say, pouring that thick red liquid into a glass. I stopped drinking them in college, and a month later ended up in the hospital with strange symptoms. Yesterday, the doctor asked me, "Who's been giving you blood transfusions all this time?" Growing up, I thought every kid had to drink their mom's special vitamins. Every morning before school, there it was on the kitchen counter, a tall glass filled with something that looked like thick cranberry juice but tasted metallic and warm. Mom would stand there watching me drink every last drop, her eyes never leaving my face. She'd smile this weird, satisfied smile when I finished, like she'd accomplished something important. If I complained about the taste, she'd get this panicked look and insist it was necessary for my health, that our family had special needs that regular vitamins couldn't meet. The routine never changed throughout my childhood. Wake up, brush teeth, drink the red stuff, eat breakfast, go to school. I remember asking my friends if their moms made them drink anything similar, but they always looked at me confused. Some had those colorful gummy vitamins or chewable tablets, but nothing like what I was getting. When I mentioned it tasted like metal and was thick like syrup, they made faces and said that sounded gross. I started to feel embarrassed about it, like maybe my family was just weird. Mom never explained what exactly was in the drink. She'd just repeat that same phrase about it being a family recipe passed down through generations. She told me our bloodline was special, that we needed extra nutrients to stay healthy. I was young and trusted her completely. Why wouldn't I? She was my mother, and mothers were supposed to know what was best for their children. The metallic taste became normal to me, just another part of my daily routine like brushing my teeth or making my bed. Looking back now, there were definitely red flags I should have noticed. Mom became increasingly protective of me after I was born, according to relatives. She rarely let me sleep over at friends' houses, always insisting I needed to be home for my morning vitamin. She'd get agitated if I was running late and might miss it, calling the school if I forgot to drink it before leaving. Other parents thought she was just overprotective, but it went beyond normal concern. When I hit middle school, I started questioning things more. The drink never seemed to help me feel more energetic like vitamins were supposed to do. If anything, I often felt sluggish and tired afterward. My friends were bouncing off the walls with energy while I needed to sit down and rest. I'd get dizzy spells sometimes, especially right after drinking the red liquid. When I mentioned this to Mom, she'd insist it was just my body adjusting and that I needed to keep taking it consistently. High school brought more questions and more resistance from me. I was old enough to understand that most vitamins came in pill form or at least didn't taste like liquid metal. The smell alone was starting to make me nauseous. It had this iron-like odor that reminded me of pennies or blood. I tried to research what kind of vitamins might look and taste like what Mom was giving me, but couldn't find anything similar online. When I asked her for the ingredient list or brand name, she'd deflect and change the subject. The worst part was how possessive she became about the whole process. She'd wake up extra early to prepare it fresh each morning, measuring everything precisely like she was conducting some kind of scientific experiment. She kept all the ingredients locked in a small refrigerator in the basement that I wasn't allowed to access. If I tried to go down there, she'd appear immediately and guide me back upstairs, claiming it was just storage for household supplies. By senior year, I was actively trying to avoid drinking it. I'd pour it down the sink when she wasn't looking, or claim I'd already taken it when she asked. But somehow she always knew when I was lying. She'd get this frantic energy and make me drink a fresh glass right in front of her. She started staying home from work more often just to supervise my morning routine, which should have been a massive warning sign. College finally gave me the escape I needed. Living in the dorms meant Mom couldn't monitor my daily habits anymore. I was relieved to be free from that awful morning ritual that had dominated my life for 18 years. The first few weeks felt liberating. I could wake up and just grab a regular breakfast without gagging down that metallic liquid. I threw myself into college life, making friends, joining clubs, trying to be a normal student. But about a month into the semester, something started going wrong with my body. I began feeling weak and dizzy constantly, much worse than those brief spells I'd had in high school. My energy levels plummeted to the point where I could barely make it through classes. I'd wake up exhausted even after sleeping for 10 hours. My skin started looking pale and grayish, and I had trouble concentrating on anything for more than a few minutes. The symptoms kept getting worse over the following weeks. I'd get short of breath just walking across campus, and my heart would race from minor physical exertion. My roommate noticed I looked sick and kept asking if I was eating enough or getting enough sleep. I insisted I was fine, just stressed about classes, but deep down I knew something was seriously wrong. I'd never felt this weak and sick in my entire life. When I finally collapsed during a lecture and had to be carried out by paramedics, I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. The emergency room doctors ran test after test, looking completely baffled by my symptoms. My blood work showed severe anemia and several other abnormalities they couldn't immediately explain. They kept me for observation while running more specialized tests, trying to figure out what was causing such dramatic health issues in someone my age. That's when they found the first clue. My blood showed signs of previous transfusions, multiple transfusions over many years. The doctor asked if I'd ever been in any serious accidents or had surgery that required blood transfusions. I told him no, that I'd been healthy my whole life aside from drinking my mom's vitamin supplements. He gave me this strange look and asked me to describe these vitamins in detail. When I explained the thick red liquid with the metallic taste, his expression changed completely. He immediately ordered more tests and started asking very specific questions about my childhood, my mother's behavior, and exactly what I'd been drinking all those years. The realization was starting to hit me even before he said it out loud. Those weren't vitamins at all. They were blood transfusions disguised as a health drink. The doctor explained that my body had become dependent on receiving regular blood transfusions, which explained why I was crashing so hard after stopping them cold turkey in college. My bone marrow had essentially stopped producing adequate red blood cells because it had been relying on the external supply for so long. Without those transfusions, I was developing severe anemia and organ stress that could become life-threatening if not addressed. I felt sick to my stomach as the implication sank in. My mother had been giving me blood transfusions my entire childhood, lying about what they were, making me dependent on them without my knowledge or consent. The trust I'd had in her, the foundation of my entire childhood, had been built on deception and medical manipulation. I couldn't even process how violated I felt, how completely she betrayed the most basic responsibility of protecting her child. Update 1. The doctors had to start me on emergency blood transfusions to stabilize my condition while they figured out a long-term treatment plan. Lying in that hospital bed, getting legitimate medical blood transfusions, I couldn't stop thinking about all those mornings in our kitchen. Every single day for 18 years, my mother had been secretly giving me someone else's blood while telling me it was vitamins. The more I thought about it, the more disturbing details I remembered. I called my mom from the hospital to confront her about what the doctors had discovered. The conversation was surreal and terrifying. Instead of denying it or acting surprised, she immediately launched into this explanation about how she'd been protecting me. She claimed that after I was born, she started having dreams and visions that I was slowly draining her life force, that I was some kind of energy vampire who would kill her if she didn't find a way to balance things out. According to her twisted logic, giving me regular blood transfusions would keep me satisfied and prevent me from unconsciously feeding off her life energy. She'd researched it online and found forums of people discussing similar beliefs about psychic vampirism and energy draining between family members. She convinced herself that this was a real medical condition that doctors wouldn't understand, so she had to treat it herself. The way she explained it, she was being a heroic mother who sacrificed her own blood to keep both of us alive and healthy. She talked about how much she loved me, how she'd give anything to protect me, how the blood transfusions were proof of her dedication. She seemed genuinely confused about why I was upset, like she expected me to be grateful for her years of secret medical procedures. But then she said something that made my blood run cold. She mentioned that she'd had to be creative about sourcing the blood over the years, especially as I got older and needed larger amounts. She'd started with her own blood initially, but realized she couldn't sustain that long-term without damaging her own health. So she'd found other ways to obtain what I needed. When I pressed her for details about these other sources, she got evasive and defensive. She insisted everything she'd done was out of love and necessity, that I wouldn't understand the sacrifices she'd made to keep me healthy. She kept repeating that it was a family recipe, that her grandmother had done similar things to protect their bloodline. The more she talked, the more I realized she was completely delusional and potentially dangerous. The doctors were horrified when I relayed this conversation to them. They immediately contacted the police and social services, even though I was legally an adult, because what my mother had done constituted serious medical abuse and possibly criminal activity. They explained that obtaining and administering unprescribed blood transfusions was illegal and extremely dangerous, that I could have contracted numerous diseases or died from incompatible blood types. That's when they decided to run comprehensive tests on my blood to check for any diseases I might have contracted over the years. They also wanted to analyze my DNA and blood markers to try to determine the sources of all the transfusions I'd received. The wait for those results was agonizing. I had no idea what kind of biological time bombs might be lurking in my system after 18 years of unregulated blood transfusions. Meanwhile, I had to figure out how to continue my education while dealing with this medical crisis. The doctors explained that weaning me off blood dependency would be a long, gradual process involving medications to stimulate my bone marrow and carefully monitored transfusions with decreasing frequency. I'd need to be under medical supervision for months, possibly years, to restore my body's natural blood production. The psychological impact was hitting me just as hard as the physical effects. Every memory of my childhood was now tainted by the knowledge of what was really happening. Those moments when Mom would smile after watching me drink the red liquid, she was satisfied because she'd successfully given me someone else's blood without me knowing. The way she'd panic if I missed a dose, she was worried about my blood levels dropping too low. I started remembering other weird things from my childhood that now made sense in this horrifying context. Mom had always been obsessed with keeping me away from doctors for routine checkups, claiming our family had natural immunity and didn't need medical intervention. She'd homeschool me whenever possible to avoid school health screenings. Anytime I got sick, she'd treat me at home rather than taking me to see a pediatrician. Update 2. The blood test results came back and delivered news that shattered what was left of my world. The doctors found multiple different blood types in my system, not just my mother's blood, but at least 4 other distinct genetic profiles. This meant she hadn't just been giving me her own blood as she'd initially claimed. She'd been obtaining blood from multiple different people over the years and mixing it into my daily transfusions. But the truly terrifying discovery was in the most recent samples they were able to analyze. The blood I'd been receiving in my final months at home didn't match my mother's DNA at all. It came from at least 2 other people, both significantly younger based on certain cellular markers. The doctors estimated the donors were likely teenagers or young adults, which raised immediate alarm bells about how my mother was obtaining this blood. I felt physically sick thinking about the implications. Where was she getting blood from teenagers? How was she extracting it? Were these people willing donors? Or was something far more sinister happening? The doctors immediately forwarded all this information to law enforcement, explaining that we were potentially looking at assault, kidnapping, or worse. The police detective assigned to the case called me that evening with questions about my mother's behavior, our home, and whether I'd noticed anything suspicious over the years. I told him about the locked refrigerator in the basement, how protective she was of that space, and how she'd always been secretive about her sources for the vitamin ingredients. He said they were working on getting a search warrant for the house. That night I couldn't sleep, thinking about all the kids from my high school who'd gone missing over the years. Our town had an unusually high number of unsolved disappearances among teenagers, something that was often discussed in local news but never seemed to lead anywhere. The police always assumed they were runaways or had left town for college opportunities elsewhere. But now I was wondering if there might be a much darker explanation. I started researching the missing persons cases online, looking at photos and timelines. There were 6 students from my graduating class alone who'd disappeared during our senior year. They'd all been classmates I knew personally, though not close friends. The police reports described them as good students from stable families who had no apparent reason to run away. Their families had never given up searching for them. The detective called me back 2 days later with news that made me physically vomit. They'd executed the search warrant on my childhood home and found the basement refrigerator filled with blood bags. Each bag was carefully labeled with names, dates, and blood type information. 6 of the names matched the missing students from my high school class. 6 bags of blood labeled with the names of kids who'd vanished without a trace. The detective explained that they'd also found detailed journals where my mother had documented her process of obtaining blood from these victims. She'd apparently been luring them to the house under various pretenses, then sedating them and extracting blood before disposing of the bodies. The journals revealed years of careful planning and execution, describing her methods with clinical detachment. According to her writings, she'd started with small animals when I was younger, then progressed to occasional homeless individuals who wouldn't be missed. But as I grew older and required larger amounts of blood, she targeted teenagers from my school because she believed younger blood would be more beneficial for my health. She'd kept detailed records of blood types, extraction amounts, and storage methods like she was running some kind of medical facility. The most chilling part was reading her justifications for the murders. She wrote about how much she loved me, how these sacrifices were necessary to keep me healthy and strong. She convinced herself that she was a devoted mother making the ultimate sacrifice for her child's well-being. In her mind, killing these teenagers was an act of maternal love, not murder. Law enforcement immediately issued an arrest warrant for my mother, but she disappeared from the house before they arrived for the search. The detective said she'd likely been monitoring police communications somehow and fled when she realized they were closing in. They'd found evidence that she'd been planning an escape route for months, with fake identification documents and cash hidden throughout the house. The media picked up the story within days, and it became a national sensation. Headlines about the blood-drinking serial killer mother who fed her victims to her own son dominated news cycles for weeks. Reporters camped outside my dorm, trying to get interviews about what it was like growing up as the unknowing beneficiary of multiple murders. I had to withdraw from classes and go into hiding just to avoid the constant harassment. The families of the missing students were notified that their children's remains would likely never be recovered, but at least they finally had answers about what had happened. Several of them reached out to me through the police, expressing forgiveness and understanding that I'd been a victim too. Their compassion in the face of such tragedy was overwhelming and helped me cope with the crushing guilt I felt. Final update. 6 months later, my mother was finally captured trying to cross the border into Mexico with forged documents. The trial became a media circus with psychological experts debating whether she was legally insane or simply evil. She maintained throughout the proceedings that everything she'd done was necessary to protect my health, showing no remorse for the murders or understanding of their impact on the victims' families. The prosecution painted a picture of a woman who'd gradually descended into delusion after my birth, convincing herself that I was some kind of supernatural entity that required blood to survive. They argued that she'd used this belief system to justify increasingly violent behavior over nearly 2 decades. The defense tried to claim she was mentally ill and couldn't distinguish right from wrong, but the detailed journals proved she understood the consequences of her actions. During her testimony, she looked directly at me and said she'd do it all again to keep me safe. She insisted that I was healthier and stronger because of her sacrifices, that any mother who truly loved her child would do the same thing. The lack of remorse or acknowledgement of her victim's humanity was disturbing to witness. She seemed genuinely confused about why everyone was treating her like a criminal instead of a devoted mother. The jury found her guilty on 6 counts of first-degree murder, plus additional charges related to the medical abuse she'd inflicted on me. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the sentencing phase, family members of her victims gave impact statements describing the years of anguish they'd endured wondering what happened to their children. Many of them broke down crying while describing the ongoing trauma of never knowing their children's fate. Meanwhile, my own recovery process was slow and complicated. The doctors had to gradually wean me off blood dependency while monitoring my body's ability to resume normal blood production. I experienced months of fatigue, weakness, and depression as my system adjusted to functioning without regular transfusions. The medications to stimulate my bone marrow caused side effects that sometimes left me bedridden for days at a time. The psychological healing was even more difficult than the physical recovery. I had to process the reality that my entire childhood was built on murder and deception. Every happy memory was now contaminated by the knowledge of how it was made possible. The breakfast conversations with my mother, the way she'd worry about my health, her pride in my academic achievements, all of it was connected to the blood of murdered teenagers. I struggled with overwhelming guilt about being the unwitting beneficiary of these crimes. Even though I logically understood that I was a victim too, it was hard to shake the feeling that I was somehow responsible for those deaths. If I hadn't been born, if I hadn't drunk those vitamins, if I'd questioned things sooner, maybe those 6 students would still be alive. Survivor's guilt became a constant companion as I tried to rebuild my life. I changed schools, moved to a different state, and tried to start over with a new identity. But the story had been too widely publicized for true anonymity. People would recognize my name or face and either treat me like a curiosity or avoid me entirely. Dating became impossible when potential partners would inevitably discover my connection to the case. The families of the victims remained surprisingly supportive throughout my recovery process. Several of them reached out periodically to check on my progress and remind me that they didn't hold me responsible for what happened. Their forgiveness was both comforting and painful. It highlighted the depth of loss they'd experienced while trying to ease my own suffering. After 2 years of medical treatment, my doctors finally declared that my blood production had returned to normal levels. I no longer needed transfusions or medications to maintain healthy blood counts. Physically, I was as recovered as I was ever going to be. The scars from years of dependency were permanent, but my body had adapted to functioning independently again. I eventually finished college with a degree in social work, partly motivated by a desire to help other victims of family abuse. Working with people who'd experienced trauma helped me process my own experiences while contributing something positive to the world. Many of my clients had their own stories of trusted adults who'd betrayed them, and I found that sharing my background sometimes helped them feel less alone. The nightmares about those morning vitamin sessions never completely went away, but they became less frequent over time. I learned to manage the anxiety and depression that came with processing such extreme childhood trauma. Some days were harder than others, especially around anniversaries of the victims' disappearances or my mother's arrest, but I developed coping strategies that allowed me to function. My mother continued writing me letters from prison for several years, still insisting that she'd acted out of love and that I should be grateful for her sacrifices. I stopped reading them after the first few because they were clearly attempts to manipulate me into maintaining contact. The prison psychologist told me she showed no signs of developing insight into her crimes and remained convinced that she'd been a devoted mother. Looking back now, I can see that my story is really about the extreme lengths that untreated mental illness can drive someone to when combined with isolation and delusion. My mother's love for me was real, but it became twisted into something monstrous that destroyed multiple families. The tragedy isn't just what happened to me or the students she killed, it's how preventable it all was if she'd received proper mental health treatment early on. The case led to changes in how missing persons investigations are conducted in our state, with more emphasis on looking for connections between disappearances and examining family members of potential victims. Several other cold cases were reopened and solved using similar investigative approaches. While that doesn't bring back the people who died, it at least prevents other families from enduring years of uncertainty about their loved ones' fates. Today, I live a quiet life focused on my work and the relationships I've been able to build with people who know my history and accept me anyway. I'll never be completely free from the shadow of what my mother did, but I've learned to carry that burden without letting it define everything about who I am. The metallic taste still sometimes haunts my dreams, but I wake up each morning grateful to be making my own choices about what I put in my body and how I want to live my life.